Hi and welcome. I'm down here. This is my wormery in my basement. And by wormery, I mean this is where I compost all of my household kitchen scraps and any sort of compostable materials using worms. And the bins behind me all have worms in them, composting down all kinds of kitchen scraps and cardboard paper. Even leaves from outside come in, you name it. And the way I've got my bins on these shelves arranged is that the oldest stuff is on top, and as I work my way down on the bottom is where I've got my newest systems stored. And the systems that I want to feed today are the ones that up until a couple days ago were considered as my two youngest Red Wiggler bins. I've now got one newer Red Wiggler bin, which is all the way down there. Just launched a couple days ago, and since it was only launched a couple days ago, that bin was built with all kinds of food in there, so they've got plenty to eat. So we're not going to be feeding that one. It's the two that are right next to it on the floor. And over here on the bench, I've got a number of different food items that we're going to use to feed them. It's a tray full of different kitchen scraps, entirely consisting of fruits. And the fruits that they're going to be getting are a combination of apple peels, apple cores, stuff like that, some strawberries and some pineapple. And the other things that you see out here are also some of the routine things that I use when I'm feeding my worm bins. It's some used coffee grounds. I have some pulverized eggshell here. This is what I use as the grit. Worms need grit as part of their digestive system to digest their food and their gizzards. And I've also got some paper scraps here, specifically coffee filters, to serve as the bedding to go hand in hand with this delicious meal. So I'm going to put that glove on. We'll get the first of the trays out here on the bench and we'll get started right away. Alright, so something going on in my Red Wiggler bins is a thing called pocket feeding or corner feeding or something like that. And all that really means is that when I feed these bins, I feed them in a different corner each time. Generally, just kind of working my way around the bin. And in all my bins now, all my Red Wiggler bins at least, I've instituted this pocket feeding approach. And in this case, this system has so far received 9 feedings. And I always count the food that was built into the bin when it was brand new as a feeding. So since then, since the worms were introduced into the bin, it's actually been 8 feedings. So that means that every feeding that has occurred in this system has been one of these corner pocket feedings. Prior to me starting that, I was feeding my bins right down the middle every time, making it really easy to know where you last fed. But since I'm changing it each time, I've been using these coffee filters. You can see on this one corner, corner is a little different because it's marking where I last fed using this coffee filter. You can see a whole bunch of castings scattered across the top here where the worms have been coming up to take advantage of the moisture. The moisture is always plentiful on top where the plastic is. And they've really ripped a hole through this thing, haven't they? All right, let's get these little guys off this paper. We'll set it aside so we can see what we're doing. I like having this paper right beneath the plastic because it provides the condensed water that accumulates on the plastic to have somewhere to drip down onto and a place for the worms to hang out and congregate. So since I'm going in a clockwise pattern, and since we last fed down here in this corner, we'll be feeding over in that corner next. And I'm thinking that even though this coffee filter has more or less been nibbled away halfway through, I think we can still use it to indicate to ourselves where we last fed once we feed over there. But like I've been doing each time we check in on these bins, we're going to just do a quick lap around the system just to see how, say for example 8 days ago, which is the last time these systems were fed, how things are progressing with the 8-day-old feeding down here. And then prior, I don't even remember what the interval was going back further at this point. But the one thing that I do know is that I started in this corner. That means that this is the second time we've now completed 2 circuits around the bin. And if we were to feed there next time, then it'll be the start of a 3rd lap around the system. And this is kind of cool, you know, because I feel like I could really put a generous amount of food in there, and I won't be back into that corner for multiple weeks, allowing the worms to really work the stuff in that corner down before I eventually circle back to feeding in that corner again. So in 8 days, you would kind of expect to find leftovers from the previous feeding. And it's always kind of a crapshoot. I never know what to expect in terms of a big turnout or a small turnout. I believe in one of the pocket feedings last week, I was a little bit surprised to find that the most recent feeding was where we found the greatest number of worms. But it's not always the case. Sometimes the greatest number of worms is actually in a slightly older than the most recent feeding. I guess mainly because the worms generally need to have the food that they're going to eat break down to a certain point before they can actually start slurping it up. So in this example here, you could see I had done pretty much what I've been doing most of the time, which is I take one of these coffee filters, not one of these flat round ones, but one of these cone-shaped ones like I showed earlier, and then I place a couple handfuls of food into them. Since I generally try to stick to a consistent portioning approach, each feeding is somewhere in the neighborhood of about 2 handfuls, give or take. And then I try to spread that couple handfuls out over, 2 or 3 coffee filters. Because the coffee filter is, paper. It's basically a carbon-rich food source. And if you know composting is, even with or without worms, is usually a mix of a carbon-rich material and also a nitrogen-rich material. So in our feedings, it's the everyday food, the kitchen scraps that are classified as the nitrogen-rich food, and it's the paper and the leaves and all those other things that are classified as the more carbon-rich food source. So I didn't really see a whole lot of turnout there yet, which is pretty much normal. Perhaps we'll see a greater amount of worms hanging out at the next oldest feeding area. And I mean, right off the top of my head, I know that it was 8 days ago that we last fed. Yeah, so I know that's how long it's been since we last fed in here. But off the top of my head, I don't know how long it's been since it was fed here, but it's generally somewhere in the neighborhood of about a week. So even though I might not know the exact number of days that have elapsed, I can, guess that it's been about 2 weeks since this feeding area was fed. And here we're seeing a little bit more progress on the food. The paper, the paper bundle, the coffee filter is still pretty much intact, but the worms have definitely moved in and are doing a number on the food that was placed inside of the coffee filter. And sometimes I go with 2 coffee filters, sometimes I go with 3. And we can see a pretty good number of worms hanging out down in this corner, which is nice to see. I generally don't want to go too crazy disrupting what's happening in these feeding areas, because it is interesting to check back in on them periodically, as we're doing right now. And by not really tearing things apart and disrupting it too much, we do sometimes catch a little glimpse into how certain types of foods are progressing. Like for example, this would be a approximately 2-week-old banana peel. We could see how it's coming along. And there's some other stuff in here too, but nothing that I was able to really distinguish. And I'm not going to go crazy picking it apart. If we stumble on something interesting that we can recognize, that's cool. I'm not going to go crazy trying to get my hands on something like that. We're just going to see what we see in our quick little check-in on each corner, and we're just going to move on. Now here, 3 feedings ago, I'm having trouble locating the bedding that was probably used to feed with. And even more hard to see is what kind of food was used in that feeding, because there's virtually nothing of it left. And for that matter, very few, if any, worms left. So they've all been, drawn into the newer feeding areas, probably because the majority of the food that was in there has been depleted. And, whatever food was in there probably emitted some moisture and some juices and probably soaked that paper and bedding and stuff that was placed in there, continuing to make that stuff a thing that the worms will continue to be able to nibble on for a while. So here's one recognizable item. It's the stem of a banana. And after, let's just say 1, 2, say maybe 3 or so weeks ago, having been placed in here, it's coming along pretty good. Although, since this bin has been getting fed this way for 2 laps around, it is possible that that is actually from 8 feedings ago, not 3 feedings ago. Or is that the right math? 1, 2, 3 feedings ago plus 4, 7 feedings ago. It's hard to say, but I mean, based on the breakdown, I would have to guess that it was probably somewhere in the neighborhood of 3 weeks ago that banana peel was placed in there. Because after 7 weeks, I would think that there'd be very little of it remaining. Now here, 4 feedings ago, we're still seeing a good number of worms hanging out, and it's probably only because the materials that were fed on that particular occasion were items that might have taken a little longer to break down or something like that. And here again, I have no way of knowing what those materials were. And here too, I could see a clearly recognizable item, typically is the banana stem. And if we could see something else in here that we recognize, that's cool. But I generally don't expect to see much that's recognizable going that far back, except for some of those slower composting items like that. But all we're going to do here is make a little bit of space so that we can add today's feeding. So that was just an interesting little tour around the worm bin, which is what I generally do when I'm feeding one of these pocket feeding systems. So I like to see how things are progressing in the previous feeding areas. And I guess besides that, I'm always kind of hoping that we're going to spot a whole bunch of worms in the process of checking out at least one of those. So that's going to be handful number 1. And I'll give them a second handful. I mean, these are fruits, all pretty soft stuff. Nothing that I would expect to last very long. The only oddball item in here that some people might raise an eyebrow at is the pineapple, because I believe it is a citrus, acidic, food item. Some people will say don't feed pineapple, but I've seen examples of worms going nuts for the pineapple and just doing away with it very, very rapidly. So I'm not concerned about the pineapple. I think they're going to do just fine with it. I think they'll enjoy it. And, in about another week or so, we'll have a chance to come back in here to see if I'm correct. Hopefully I am. But I like to include a little bit of grit usually, especially in my slightly newer bins. With this bin, at this point, being 66 days old today. It's over 2 months old, so it's not even that new anymore. But still, if it was still a brand new bin, where maybe the only grit in it is the grit that was applied when I first built the bin, I like including grit pretty regularly, at least in the beginning. Later on, I start to get that sense that there's probably still a lot of lingering grit within the system from previous feedings that the worms can take advantage of. But in the earlier stages of a bin, I really want to make sure that the worms have a sufficient amount of grit so that they can work down the foods that I'm giving them. So that's where we fed today. So we use our little coffee filter marker to show us where that was. Because if that wasn't there, you would be, hard pressed to distinguish one corner from the other in these bins, right? It'd be hard to remember where we last fed. Although in all of my bins, I've been trying to remain consistent. So all of the 4 bins that are getting pocket fed this week are all being fed in that corner right there. Because I did start the process in one corner in all of my bins, and then I followed suit when feeding them all. So it shouldn't be too big of a mystery, but it is just easiest to mark it. And this way you know right away where the last feeding was without any guesswork. Okay, that was fun. In my newer bins, I'm usually, you know, waiting for that point where the bin finally looks like it's already mostly castings as opposed to being mostly uncomposted bedding bits and paper and leaves and stuff like that. And in this bin, I think after 2 months now, we're finally at that stage where the bin seems to be reaching that nice maturity level where it does look like a good, you know, active worm bin as opposed to just a bin full of leaves and cardboard. So we're going to press on now to the next younger bin. Let me put this one away and we'll go fetch that one. Okay, so this is a slightly larger container, not by much. It's about the same length, same depth, just a little bit wider. And the same story here, but a little different because instead of just having a sheet of plastic like the one I just removed, I've actually got 2 plastic coverings here, and this second plastic covering is actually integrated with the cardboard covering as well. And my thinking on that was that it might just be a little bit more manageable instead of having a piece of, you know, floppy plastic whipping around in the wind, knocking off its castings everywhere, making a mess. I just thought that it was just a little bit, you know, maybe neater to have this cardboard holding the plastic, keeping it firm from flopping around and making a mess. So here we've got a coffee filter that's in somewhat better shape than the one we just saw in the other bin. And this is what we're going to use to mark after we fed, but the last feeding was here. Same thing as what we saw in the other bin. And then here, the paper that's covering the top is extremely tattered. I mean, it is shot. So, you know, a lot of times I'll do my best to try to preserve these sheets of paper to maximize the number of times I can cover up the system with it. But I'm starting to think that at this point, this is just generic bedding at this point. It's not really a single piece of paper that I can easily cover things up with. And that's fine. I should be able to look around here and hopefully find a piece of paper we could use to replace that. Because like I said, I like to have some sort of a piece of paper right there underneath the plastic where all the moisture that would otherwise try to evaporate gets caught and drops back down onto. Here in this bin you can see right away what a difference, right? A lot of very clearly recognizable leaves as well as pieces of cardboard and paper. And it won't be that way for much longer. The worms will eventually break it all down. It's nice, neat castings for us. But as you work your way from the very mature bins to the fairly young bins, you'll see more and more of the bedding and cardboard and paper and all that material that was used to build the bin. And like we were doing in the other bin, we're just going to take a peek at how things are progressing in the most recent feeding. So I'm not going to go crazy ripping it up because in this bin I do have, you might have seen some traces of it a moment ago. Right here is a little piece of it, for example. I've got some beach towel, and when I built this bin I laid that beach towel in here, kind of spread it around, and if I were to go trying to pull it out of this corner, I would uproot it from the entire bin and make a big huge mess, although I'm not really seeing many signs of it. I know it's down there, it's got to be, because I saw distinct signs of it last time we were in here. I don't think that they would have done away with it so quickly. But here we can see some traces of the previous feeding. Here, for example, we've got the outer shell of an avocado with some of the avocado still in it. That one must have just gone bad. This is a piece of asparagus with a worm hanging out inside of it. And then here, I believe, is a chunk of tomato still stuck to the piece of paper, the coffee filter that was used to deliver the food, in its little burrito wrapping. And then, like right here, is that chunk of beach towel. And it looks like the worms are kind of making themselves at home on it. I never tried composting fabrics yet in my worm bins, although I've known for some time that it was possible. Here's an example of an avocado seed. Normally it's, you know, a big tough round object, but when you slice it up like this, and yeah, you can slice it, it just, you know, significantly increases its surface area, making it much easier for the worms to break it down. And I could feel it would break quite readily in my hands if I were to try to break it. And I'm guessing by the next time we check in on this corner, that thing might actually just break from handling it, but I'm going to try to leave it intact and let the worms rip it apart instead of me breaking it apart by hand. Here's just the stem of some tomatoes. So whatever, like I said, kitchen scraps, right? Anything goes for the most part. And here's also some of the bedding that was used to originally build the bin. It's part of an egg carton. And I thought that the pieces that I had used were somewhat larger. Maybe this one's getting whittled down over time, which is a good sign. Okay, that was kind of fun. Let's use all this stuff that we scraped off the top to cover up with here. And we'll just take a quick peek into all the other older corners too, without making too much of a disruption if possible. Things seem a little bit dry over here. Maybe I could do a better job covering things up in this corner. Oh yeah, almost forgot. Besides the oddball food item of a beach towel being placed in here, I also figured I would give a try with these pine cones, because I heard that people have had success composting pine cones. So I've got pine cones in here, 2 of them. So we might bump into the other one later too. And here's just some more of that beach towel. This beach towel was really tattered. It was just kind of forgotten about, sitting outside, not outside, but near a window where the sun was shining on it every day for years and years, many years. So the UV light has already pretty much destroyed that towel. And it's extremely fragile. It just breaks and tears in your hand if you handle it too roughly. So I don't expect that towel to last too long. Like, here's one of our food bundles. Maybe it was just wrapped a little bit too tight to enable the worms to get into it or something. It felt like there was just a big chunk of leftover food in here, but I think all that was in here was a big chunk of coffee. Alright. I don't want to have like a bundle that the worms can't get into. So in cases like this, I will at least open it up. I don't want to tear it up or mess it up too much, but I'd like to try to keep it intact if possible. And just let the worms work it down. So like I said, I sense a little bit of dryness down here in this corner. Maybe I've got to take greater care to cover things up when I put the plastic coverings back on here. Try to keep the moisture from escaping through here and drying things out excessively. So yeah, things are coming along. I mean, besides the coffee, I don't think I saw much of anything else. Here's a banana stem, so one recognizable food item besides the coffee. And mostly bedding. Now we're going back 3 feedings. And things feel a little bit more damp down here, which I think the worms will favor. So over here in the corner that we just checked, between it being pretty much depleted of food for the most part and being kind of dry, not surprising that we didn't see a great number of worms down in there. But here we're seeing a number of worms hanging out. But since this goes back even another week or so, somewhere in the neighborhood of about 3 weeks now, it's not surprising that we're not seeing many leftovers, although this big chunk of stuff, I would have to assume, has some leftovers in it. This is probably a apple seed, yeah. So apples have been fed here previously, and they'll be fed again today. So let's get going with that. As we excavate this last corner, there was a feeding applied there too, but at this point it would be 4 feedings ago. So if we find anything in there, it'll probably be pretty far gone. But it's always kind of a surprise. You never know what to expect. So I'm wondering if we'll see worms in here or not much of anything. Let's see. Here the moisture feels pretty good too. A good amount of bedding, as well as some of that beach towel. Paper bits. I believe in this corner I just had a whole bunch of scrap newspaper, which I used as bedding rather than the coffee filters on that occasion. Because that's what I'm seeing. And oh, here's the other pine cone. It's taking on a green color. I don't know if that's some form of mold or something, so that's usually a good sign. The worms usually can't just rip right into many food items. In lots of cases they require the mold and the bacteria and the microbes to work the food down a little bit before they can get at it. So let's just return some of these older items to where they were and pile in today's fresh feeding. Okay, same story as before. And you know what? I'm questioning whether we need these because, as we talked about earlier, that top covering paper, here again, this will be the corner that doesn't receive coffee filters. This will be the corner that gets salvaged newspaper bits used as bedding every time. And that's what we're going to do here. We're just going to salvage that piece of paper that was draped across the top, and then we'll drop in the remainder of the food here. That should work out quite nicely. I can only imagine that all this nice sweet fruit is going to really draw the attention of the worms quickly. So hopefully they enjoy it. I'm wondering how much of this coffee I could do away with today. It feels like we're almost there. I don't want to go overboard though. That'll be enough for now. Let's get to covering things back up here. And you know, I don't have a newspaper. As much as I would like to drape a fresh piece of newspaper out across the top over here, I ran out a few days ago. So I don't have any newspaper, but you know what we could do? Since, like I said earlier, I like to have some sort of paper, some sort of a material right below where the plastic coverings get put on. Why don't we use these two? A little different from what I usually do, because these usually serve the purpose of just being the bedding that goes hand in hand with the feeding. But we're going to give them a different purpose today. We're going to use these as our top covering pieces of paper. And then hopefully next time we pop in here, this is where we're going to find a whole bunch of worms coming up to take advantage of any moisture that has, you know, collected on the plastic right above it and fallen onto those sheets of paper. All right. So I guess what I usually try to do is, like we saw earlier, this corner was a bit dry, so I usually try to push this into one of the corners as much as I can to get as much coverage as possible. But maybe this little bowing over here, I don't know, I don't know if the tub is bowing out or if just the shape of the cardboard underneath it has kind of a cut that bows inward. But it does seem like the cardboard itself might be contributing to the dryness happening over here. That's okay, doesn't matter so much. So to complement that, since we're pushed into this corner and leaving these two edges a little bit exposed to the air, I'll use this supplemental piece of plastic to try to cover those other opposite edges. And then here too, we've got a little bit of airflow happening on those corners over there. I'm not going to sweat it too much. It should work out well. So I've only got a few things to put away here and clean up. I'll clean my glove, I'll clean this tray, and I'll put this box away as well. But before I do, let me just quickly say thank you. Thanks so much for watching. Hopefully you enjoyed the video. If you did, please remember to leave me a quick thumbs up. That's always really appreciated. And if you haven't done so already, also consider subscribing to the channel too. That's really appreciated as well. All right, everyone. Thanks for watching. Have a great day. Bye.